The 1925 abandoned farm, a ruin, but what the window revealed is a cry from the past. In the spring of 2019, documentary photographer Marcus Chen was exploring rural Nebraska for a project on agricultural decline when he discovered a collection of glass plate negatives in the basement of a demolished farmhouse near the town of Millbrook. Among the dust-covered photographic plates, dated between 1920 and 1925, was an image that would challenge everything historians knew about the Great Depression's impact on rural communities and force them to confront evidence of tragedies that had been deliberately hidden from official records. The photograph, taken in October 1925, showed the ruins of what appeared to be the Blackwood family farm, a once prosperous homestead, reduced to crumbling stone walls, broken windows, and a collapsed barn that spoke of sudden abandonment and financial ruin. What made Marcus examine the image more closely was a detail that seemed impossible, given the farm's apparent desolation. In the shattered window of the main house's upper floor, barely visible through the jagged glass, was the pale, gaunt face of a child, staring out with an expression of such desperate anguish that it seemed to transcend the photograph itself. Dr. Catherine Wells, a historian specializing in Great Depression-era rural sociology at the University of Nebraska, was contacted when Marcus's preliminary research revealed that the photograph might be connected to one of the Midwest's most disturbing unsolved mysteries: the disappearance of the Blackwood family in the winter of 1925, an incident that had been quietly suppressed by local authorities and had never been adequately investigated, despite evidence suggesting that multiple family members had vanished under circumstances that defied conventional explanation. The Blackwood farm had been established in 1892 by German immigrant Heinrich Blackwood, who had purchased 640 acres of prime Nebraska farmland, using savings accumulated during 15 years of working in Chicago's stockyards. Heinrich's success had been built on innovative farming techniques he had learned in the old country, combined with the fertile soil and favorable climate that had made Nebraska one of America's most productive agricultural regions during the early 20th century. By 1920, the Blackwood operation had become one of the most prosperous farms in the county, supporting 3 generations of family members and employing seasonal workers from throughout the region. Heinrich had arrived in America in 1877 as part of the wave of German immigration that followed the economic disruptions of the Franco-Prussian War. Unlike many immigrants who settled in urban areas, Heinrich had been determined to recreate the rural lifestyle he had known in Württemberg, where his family had farmed the same land for 7 generations. His knowledge of old-world agricultural techniques, including crop rotation systems and livestock breeding practices that were advanced for their time, had given him significant advantages over other homesteaders who lacked his technical expertise. The farm's prosperity had made the Blackwood family pillars of the local community, with Heinrich serving on the county agricultural board and his eldest son, Wilhelm, managing the farm's expansion into livestock breeding and grain storage operations. The family had built a substantial 2-story stone house that reflected their success, featuring modern conveniences that were rare in rural areas of the era, including electric lighting powered by a private generator, running water from an artesian well, and central heating that made the Nebraska winters bearable for the growing family. The Blackwood homestead had become a model of agricultural innovation, attracting visitors from throughout the Midwest who came to study Heinrich's methods for maximizing crop yields while maintaining soil fertility. The farm featured experimental test plots, where Heinrich evaluated new varieties of corn and wheat, extensive root cellars for food storage that could sustain the family through the harshest winters, and a sophisticated irrigation system that allowed consistent production even during drought years. By 1925, 3 generations of Blackwoods called the farm home. Heinrich and his wife Greta, now in their 70s but still active in farm management, their son Wilhelm and his wife Martha, who had assumed primary responsibility for daily operations. Wilhelm's 3 children, Klaus, age 16, Emma, age 12, and 9-year-old Anna, and Heinrich's widowed daughter-in-law Bertha, whose husband had died in France during the Great War, leaving her to raise her twin daughters, Liesel and Marie, both aged 14. Dr. Wells's analysis of the mysterious photograph using modern digital enhancement technology revealed details that had been invisible to 1925 examination methods. The face in the upper window was clearly that of a young child, perhaps 8 or 10 years old, with features distorted by what appeared to be extreme malnutrition or illness. The child's eyes were sunken deep into hollow sockets, while the skin, stretched tight over prominent cheekbones, created an almost skeletal appearance that was inconsistent with the Blackwood family's reputation for prosperity and good health. Advanced photographic analysis confirmed that the image had not been manipulated using any technique available in 1925. The glass plate negative showed no evidence of double exposure, retouching, or composite photography. Chemical analysis of the photographic emulsion revealed that the image had been captured using standard silver halide processes, with no unusual substances or treatments that might have created artificial effects. Most disturbing was the realization that the child in the window appeared to be looking directly at the camera, suggesting conscious awareness of the photographer's presence despite the building's apparent abandonment. The digital enhancement revealed additional disturbing details that had been obscured by the photograph's age and the poor lighting conditions during its capture. The child's clothing appeared to be tattered and stained, hanging loosely on a frame that seemed far too thin for normal health. Most remarkably, the enhancement process revealed what appeared to be other faces in different windows of the ruined house, shadowy, indistinct figures that seemed to be watching from the dark interior, though their features were too unclear to identify specific individuals. The investigation revealed that the photographer had been Samuel Morrison, a traveling documentary photographer who had been commissioned by the Nebraska State Agricultural Department to document the effects of economic hardship on rural communities during the mid-1920s recession that had preceded the more famous stock market crash of 1929. Morrison's assignment had been to create a visual record of farm abandonment and rural poverty that could be used to justify state assistance programs for struggling agricultural communities. Morrison had been one of the pioneering documentary photographers of the era, influenced by the social realism movement that sought to expose the harsh realities of American life through unflinching visual documentation. His work had been featured in major magazines and had helped shape public understanding of rural poverty during the economic disruptions that preceded the Great Depression. The Blackwood Farm assignment had been intended as a routine documentation project, but it had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Morrison's personal journals, discovered in the same basement where Marcus had found the photographic plates, contained detailed accounts of his visit to the Blackwood Farm in October 1925. According to his notes, Morrison had expected to find a typical abandoned homestead, with empty buildings and overgrown fields that would serve as symbols of agricultural decline. Instead, he had encountered what he described as evidence of a tragedy so profound and disturbing that I question whether it should be documented or buried alongside those who suffered it. The Blackwood Farm presents a scene of desolation that extends beyond mere economic hardship into realms of human suffering that challenge my ability to comprehend, Morrison wrote in his journal entry, dated October 15, 1925. The buildings show signs of hasty abandonment, with personal possessions scattered, as if the occupants had fled in panic rather than departing according to any organized plan. Most disturbing are the indications that not all residents successfully escaped whatever catastrophe befell this once prosperous homestead. Morrison's detailed observations documented evidence of a rapid decline in the farm's operations during the months preceding his visit. The fields showed signs of crops that had been planted but never harvested, with withered corn stalks and rotting vegetables suggesting that the family had disappeared during the growing season when their labor was most crucial to the farm's success. Livestock pens stood empty but showed no evidence of organized sale or transfer, implying that animals had either died or wandered away after being abandoned without care. The photographer's investigation of the main house had revealed signs of a desperate struggle against circumstances that transcended normal economic hardship. Windows had been boarded from the inside rather than the outside, suggesting that the occupants had been trying to keep something out, rather than simply protecting empty property from vandalism. Food stores in the basement had been completely exhausted, with empty root cellars and depleted grain bins indicating that the family had consumed their reserves entirely before disappearing. Most disturbing were Morrison's discoveries in the house's upper floors, where evidence suggested that the family's final weeks had been marked by increasing desperation and what appeared to be supernatural harassment. Furniture had been arranged to barricade doorways. Religious icons had been nailed to walls and windows in patterns that suggested protective rituals rather than mere decoration, and several rooms contained evidence of makeshift sleeping arrangements that indicated the family had been afraid to use their normal bedrooms. Morrison had found evidence that the Blackwood family had been receiving increasingly desperate letters from relatives in Germany during their final months, correspondence that suggested the family's troubles were part of a larger pattern of misfortune affecting their extended clan. These letters, written in German but translated by Morrison with the help of local interpreters, described similar disappearances and supernatural harassment affecting Blackwood relatives who had remained in Europe, suggesting that the family was being pursued by forces that transcended geographical boundaries. If you're as intrigued as we are by these secrets of the past, consider subscribing to not miss any of our future investigations. Dr. Wells's research into the Blackwood family's history revealed that their disappearance had been preceded by several months of increasingly strange reports from neighbors and local residents. Beginning in the spring of 1925, people living near the Blackwood farm had reported unusual phenomena: unexplained lights moving through the property during nighttime hours, sounds of machinery operating when no work was being conducted, and most disturbing of all, glimpses of figures moving through the farmhouse windows long after the family was known to be absent from the property. The investigation revealed that Heinrich Blackwood had approached local authorities multiple times during the summer of 1925, reporting what he described as intrusions by unknown persons who seemed able to enter and exit the property despite locked doors and secured windows. Local sheriff's deputies had investigated these complaints, but had found no evidence of trespassing or criminal activity, leading them to dismiss Heinrich's concerns as the result of stress and overwork. Sheriff William Patterson's incident reports, preserved in county archives, documented a pattern of increasingly frantic complaints from Heinrich Blackwood during the summer of 1925. The reports described Heinrich's claims that intruders were stealing food from his stores, moving objects within the house, and leaving behind what he termed signs and symbols that seemed designed to terrorize the family. Deputy investigations had found no evidence to support these claims, leading authorities to suspect that Heinrich was suffering from mental deterioration brought on by age and financial stress. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Millbrook Gazette documented the family's growing isolation during their final months. Wilhelm Blackwood had withdrawn his children from the local school in August 1925, claiming that unsafe conditions made it impossible for them to travel to town. The family had stopped attending church services, ended their participation in community social events, and gradually ceased all interaction with neighboring farms, despite their long-standing relationships within the rural community. The investigation revealed that the Blackwood family's isolation had been accompanied by increasingly erratic behavior that had alarmed their neighbors and business associates. Local merchants reported that family members who had once been regular and sociable customers had become secretive and suspicious, making purchases of unusual items, including large quantities of salt, iron implements, and religious artifacts that had no obvious agricultural purpose. Thomas Anderson, owner of the Millbrook General Store, had kept detailed records of the Blackwood family's purchases during 1925, documentation that revealed a progressive shift from normal farming supplies to items associated with folk magic and spiritual protection. The family had purchased dozens of horseshoes, bags of salt, religious medals from multiple Christian denominations, and Native American sage bundles, purchases that suggested they were attempting to create spiritual barriers using protective traditions from various cultures. The last confirmed sighting of any Blackwood family member had occurred on September 30th, 1925, when Heinrich had appeared at the Millbrook General Store to purchase what witnesses described as an unusual quantity of salt, iron nails, and religious medallions. Store owner Thomas Patterson had noted that Heinrich appeared nervous and distracted, speaking in rapid German and frequently glancing over his shoulder as if expecting pursuit. Heinrich had paid for his purchases in cash and had departed immediately without engaging in the social conversation that normally accompanied visits to town. Dr. Wells's investigation expanded to include research into similar cases of family disappearances in rural Nebraska during the 1920s, seeking patterns that might explain what had happened to the Blackwoods. Her analysis revealed a disturbing trend of farm families who had vanished without explanation during the economic hardships that preceded the Great Depression, typically leaving behind evidence of supernatural harassment and desperate attempts at spiritual protection. The research revealed that at least 12 farming families in eastern Nebraska had disappeared between 1920 and 1925, all under circumstances that shared common characteristics with the Blackwood case. Each family had reported strange phenomena in the months preceding their disappearance, had gradually isolated themselves from their communities, and had left behind evidence of having consumed all food stores before vanishing. Most significantly, all of the abandoned properties had been associated with subsequent reports of ghostly apparitions and supernatural activity that made them uninhabitable for future occupants. The investigation revealed that the affected farms were concentrated in an area that corresponded to land that had been acquired through the Homestead Act from Native American tribes during the 1860s and 1870s. Dr. Wells consulted with tribal historians who provided context for understanding the spiritual significance of the affected region according to indigenous traditions that predated European settlement by centuries. Professor James Windwalker of the University of Nebraska's Native American Studies Department provided crucial insights into the spiritual geography of the affected region. According to Omaha and Ponca tribal traditions, the area where the Blackwood farm was located had been considered sacred but dangerous territory, associated with spiritual forces that could bring either great prosperity or terrible misfortune, depending on how the land was treated by its occupants. Our ancestors understood that this land carried what you might call spiritual obligations, Professor Windwalker explained during his consultation with Dr. Wells. The earth itself was seen as a living entity that required proper relationship and regular ceremony to maintain balance. When European settlers arrived and began intensive agriculture without understanding these spiritual requirements, they unknowingly incurred debts that would eventually demand payment. According to Omaha and Ponca tribal elders, the area where the Blackwood farm was located had been considered sacred but dangerous territory, associated with spiritual forces that could bring either great prosperity or terrible misfortune, depending on how the land was treated by its occupants. The tribes had maintained specific rituals and practices that were believed to maintain harmony with these spiritual forces, but European settlers had been unaware of these traditions and had failed to observe the spiritual protocols necessary for safe occupation of the territory. The tribal historians explained that the land carried what they termed spiritual debt, accumulated obligations that required regular payment through appropriate ceremonies and offerings. Failure to maintain these spiritual relationships could result in the land itself turning against its occupants, creating conditions where families would be consumed by the very forces that had once provided their prosperity. The timing of the family disappearances, corresponding with the economic pressures of the 1920s, suggested that the spiritual debt had come due at a moment when the affected families were least able to understand or address the supernatural forces acting against them. The investigation revealed that the spiritual obligations associated with the affected territory were particularly complex because the land had been the site of a significant indigenous burial ground that had been disturbed during the initial homesteading period. Tribal traditions maintained that such disruption created permanent spiritual imbalances that could only be addressed through specific ceremonies involving the voluntary participation of those who had benefited from the land's fertility. As we delve deeper into these mysteries, we invite you to join our community of explorers of the inexplicable. Subscribe and become part of the search for truth. Dr. Wells's analysis of German folk traditions, brought by immigrants like Heinrich Blackwood, revealed additional context for understanding the family's final months. German rural folklore included extensive traditions about supernatural forces that could be awakened by disruption of spiritual balance, particularly in situations where families had achieved prosperity through means that violated natural or spiritual law. These traditions described entities known as land hunger, land spirits that could claim entire families as payment for spiritual debts that had accumulated over generations of occupation. Heinrich's background in the Black Forest region of Germany had exposed him to folklore traditions that recognized the existence of territorial spirits that demanded respect and periodic offerings from human occupants. His increasing purchases of protective items during the family's final months suggested that he had recognized the supernatural nature of the forces threatening his family and had been attempting to apply old-world protective practices to combat threats that originated from entirely different spiritual traditions. The investigation revealed that Heinrich Blackwood had become increasingly interested in both German folk practices and Native American spiritual traditions during his final months, apparently seeking protection from forces that he recognized but did not fully understand. Neighbors had reported seeing smoke rising from unusual fires on the Blackwood property during nighttime hours, suggesting that Heinrich had been conducting rituals based on his fragmentary understanding of spiritual practices from multiple traditions. Martha Schneider, whose farm bordered the Blackwood property, had provided detailed accounts of the supernatural phenomena she had observed during the family's final months. Her testimony, recorded by local church officials who had been investigating reports of demonic activity, described increasingly intense manifestations that had terrified the entire rural community. Throughout the summer of 1925, we could see lights moving through the Blackwood house during the night hours, Martha had reported. These were not normal lamplights or candle flames, but cold blue illuminations that seemed to move of their own accord, sometimes appearing in multiple rooms simultaneously. Most disturbing were the sounds, voices speaking in languages that none of us recognized, accompanied by what sounded like machinery operating, despite the fact that the Blackwoods had no mechanical equipment that could produce such noises. Morrison's journal contained descriptions of evidence he had discovered, suggesting that the Blackwood family's final weeks had been marked by desperate attempts to appease spiritual forces through increasingly extreme measures. The photographer had found remains of ritual fires in every room of the house, along with salt circles, iron crosses, and arrangements of religious objects that suggested the family had been trying to create spiritual barriers against supernatural intrusion. Most disturbing were Morrison's discoveries in the house's cellar, where evidence suggested that the family had been forced to sacrifice their food stores as offerings to spiritual entities that demanded increasingly costly payments. Empty grain bins had been arranged in ritual patterns, while the walls bore symbols that appeared to combine German folk magic with Native American spiritual imagery that Heinrich had apparently learned from sources that Morrison could not identify. The photographer's investigation had revealed that the child visible in the window of his 1925 photograph was likely Anna Blackwood, Heinrich's youngest granddaughter, who would have been 9 years old at the time of the family's disappearance. Anna's presence in the abandoned house suggested that not all family members had vanished simultaneously, and that some had been left behind to face whatever spiritual forces had claimed the others. Morrison's journal entries described his growing conviction that Anna and possibly other family members had been trapped within the farmhouse by supernatural forces that prevented their escape while slowly draining their life force through starvation and spiritual consumption. The photographer had attempted to enter the house to investigate Anna's condition, but had found all doors and windows sealed by what he described as invisible barriers that resist physical force and seem to repel human presence. The investigation revealed that Morrison had contacted local authorities about his discovery of Anna in the window, but his reports had been dismissed as hallucinations brought on by spending too much time in isolated rural areas. The photographer had returned to the Blackwood farm multiple times during October and November 1925, documenting Anna's gradual deterioration through a series of photographs that showed her becoming increasingly gaunt and skeletal as whatever force held her prisoner continued to drain her strength. Morrison's photographic record revealed a systematic documentation of supernatural predation that challenged conventional understanding of how spiritual forces could affect physical reality. Each successive image showed Anna becoming more translucent and ethereal, as if her physical substance was gradually being consumed by entities that fed on human life force while preserving consciousness in forms that transcended normal biological existence. Dr. Wells's analysis of Morrison's complete photographic record revealed that Anna had survived in the house for at least 6 weeks after the rest of her family had disappeared, sustained by unknown means, but gradually weakening as the supernatural forces consuming her grew stronger. The final photograph in Morrison's series, taken in early December 1925, showed only an empty window, suggesting that Anna had finally succumbed to whatever fate had befallen the rest of her family. The investigation expanded to include research into the subsequent history of the Blackwood property, seeking evidence of continued supernatural activity that might confirm Morrison's documentation of paranormal phenomena. Property records revealed that the farm had remained abandoned for decades after the family's disappearance, with multiple attempts to sell or lease the land failing due to reports of ghostly apparitions and supernatural harassment of potential occupants. Several families had attempted to establish new homesteads on the Blackwood property during the 1930s and 1940s, but none had remained for more than a few months. Former residents consistently reported similar phenomena: glimpses of spectral figures moving through the ruins of the original house, sounds of children crying from empty rooms, and an overwhelming sense of despair that made normal daily life impossible to maintain. The Miller family, who had attempted to farm the Blackwood land in 1934, had left behind detailed accounts of their experiences that corroborated Morrison's observations about the property's supernatural activity. John Miller's diary, discovered among county historical records, described ongoing encounters with apparitions that seemed to be reenacting the final days of the Blackwood family's disappearance. Each night we observed lights moving through the ruins of the old house, accompanied by the sounds of voices calling out in what appears to be German, Miller had written. Most disturbing is the figure of a young girl who appears in the upstairs window, always at the same time just after sunset. She seems to be pleading for help, but approaches to the house are met with an overwhelming sense of dread that makes investigation impossible. The research revealed that the Blackwood property had eventually been acquired by the state of Nebraska during the 1950s and had been designated as unsuitable for agricultural use despite the high quality of the soil. Official records cited environmental concerns as the reason for removing the land from productive use, but Dr. Wells's investigation revealed that the real reason had been the inability to find anyone willing to work the property due to its reputation for supernatural harassment. Modern paranormal investigators who had visited the site of the former Blackwood farm reported experiences that corroborated Morrison's 1925 observations. Electronic equipment frequently malfunctioned when operated near the ruins of the original house, while thermal imaging had detected heat signatures that appeared to represent human figures despite the absence of any living occupants. Most remarkably, several investigators had reported seeing a child's face in the window of the ruined house, precisely matching Morrison's description of Anna Blackwood's final appearance. The paranormal investigation team, led by Dr. Sarah Chen of the International Society for Paranormal Research, had conducted extensive documentation of the Blackwood site during multiple visits between 2015 and 2018. Their findings included electromagnetic anomalies that suggested the presence of significant spiritual activity, audio recordings of voices speaking in German dialects consistent with the Blackwood family's background, and photographic evidence that appeared to show multiple human figures occupying the ruins of the farmhouse. Dr. Wells's research into similar phenomena revealed that the Blackwood case represented one of the most thoroughly documented examples of what folklorists termed spiritual consumption, supernatural predation that gradually drained the life force of human occupants while trapping them within specific locations. The phenomenon appeared to be associated with areas where Native American spiritual traditions had been disrupted by European settlement, creating conditions where ancient protective practices were no longer maintained and dangerous spiritual forces could emerge unchecked. The investigation revealed that the child visible in Morrison's photograph represented more than historical curiosity. Anna Blackwood appeared to have become a permanent fixture of the property's supernatural ecosystem, trapped by the same forces that had consumed her family, but preserved in a state that allowed her continued existence as a warning to future occupants. Her presence in the window served as both evidence of the family's tragic fate and a guardian spirit that protected others from suffering similar consumption by driving away potential victims before they could be claimed. Contemporary attempts to provide spiritual assistance to Anna Blackwood had been undertaken by various religious groups and paranormal investigators, but none had succeeded in freeing her from whatever supernatural forces maintained her imprisonment. Native American spiritual leaders, who had performed traditional cleansing ceremonies at the site, reported that the spiritual debt associated with the property was too extensive to be resolved through normal means, and that Anna's continued presence was necessary to prevent the spread of the consuming forces to other locations. The investigation revealed that several Native American ceremonies had been conducted at the Blackwood site during the 1960s and 1970s, rituals designed to restore spiritual balance and provide peace for the trapped souls. Elder Joseph Windwalker of the Omaha tribe had led these ceremonies, working with tribal spiritual leaders to address the complex spiritual obligations that had been created by the disruption of the original burial ground and the subsequent consumption of the Blackwood family. Anna's spirit serves as a bridge between worlds, Elder Windwalker had explained during a 1978 ceremony. She maintains the spiritual barriers that prevent the consuming forces from spreading while preserving the memory of what occurred as a warning to others. Her sacrifice allows the land to gradually heal while protecting future generations from similar tragedies. Dr. Wells's final analysis of Morrison's 1925 photograph concluded that it represented unprecedented documentation of supernatural phenomena that challenged fundamental assumptions about the relationship between spiritual forces and physical reality. The image provided evidence that certain locations could become focal points for spiritual consumption that transcended normal concepts of life and death, creating conditions where human consciousness could be preserved indefinitely within supernatural prison systems. The investigation revealed that Anna Blackwood's continued presence at the farm site served multiple spiritual functions, warning potential occupants about the dangers associated with the property, maintaining spiritual barriers that prevented the consuming forces from spreading to other areas, and preserving the memory of her family's sacrifice as a reminder of the costs associated with disrupting indigenous spiritual traditions without understanding their protective purposes. The research had broader implications for understanding the relationship between European settlement patterns and Native American spiritual geography throughout the American Midwest. The Blackwood case demonstrated that successful occupation of indigenous territories required more than legal ownership or agricultural expertise. It demanded understanding of and respect for spiritual systems that had maintained balance between human communities and natural forces for centuries before European arrival. In her concluding report, Dr. Wells reflected on the profound implications of the Blackwood case for understanding the relationship between European settlement patterns and Native American spiritual traditions. The tragedy demonstrated that successful occupation of indigenous territories required more than legal ownership or agricultural expertise. It demanded understanding of and respect for spiritual systems that had maintained balance between human communities and natural forces for centuries before European arrival. The story of the abandoned farm reminds us that the American frontier was built upon foundations that extended far beyond property deeds and homestead claims into spiritual relationships with the land that European settlers rarely understood or respected. Anna Blackwood's face, preserved forever in Morrison's 1925 photograph, serves as a testament to the costs of that ignorance and a warning that some debts transcend individual lifetimes to affect entire communities across generations. Perhaps most remarkably, Anna's continued presence at the farm site represents a form of justice that operates according to spiritual rather than human law. The transformation of victim into guardian, ensuring that the forces that consumed her family cannot claim additional victims without providing clear warning of the spiritual costs involved. Her pale, desperate face in the broken window serves as both cry from the past and protection for the future, demonstrating that some forms of suffering can be transformed into compassionate service to others. The past guards secrets that challenge comprehension, and what we've uncovered in the shadows of that abandoned farmhouse reveals that some places carry spiritual debts that can consume entire families, leaving behind only warning spirits who guard against future tragedies. Perhaps the real question isn't what happened to the Blackwood family, but whether we have the wisdom to recognize when the land itself demands payment for generations of spiritual neglect and the courage to honor indigenous traditions that could prevent such tragedies from recurring. The true nature of this mystery remains in the shadows, but we want to know your opinion. Use the comments section below and tell us what you believe. If you are fascinated by unraveling the secrets behind our darkest histories, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications, for there is much more to be unmasked.